Hello, my friends. Let me welcome you to a brief talk about two books that I recently published, one in the United States and one here in Guyana. The major book or the major work is entitled My Story, My Song. The other book that was published in Guyana is called 104 Times. My Story, My Song is approximately 570 pages, while the other book, 104 Times, is about 270 pages as well. These two books was a kind of therapy for me during this pandemic period. And for the period since the People's Progressive Party Civic was out of government from 2015 to 2020. Not to say that it took me 5 years to write these two books. I began writing these two books just before the pandemic broke at the global community level. And so it took me approximately 1 year or a little more, a few months, to complete My Story, My Song. Interestingly, while I was writing My Story, My Song, in order not to get myself too much distracted, or in a sense to move away from writing and focusing exclusively on My Story, My Song, I began writing letters to the editors of two major newspapers in Guyana. Basically, the Starbuck News and the Kaieteur News. As I said at the launch, I had some difficulties with the two other newspapers or major newspapers, mainstream media, which is the Chronicle and the Guyana Times. And so most of my letters that are to be found in the smaller book, 104 Times, are basically letters to the editors of those two newspapers that I converted into articles. Some people have asked me, why 104 times? What does it mean? What is the significance of 104 times? It seems somewhat mysterious to them. But as I explained to them, I wrote many letters to the newspapers, mainstream media in our country. But I extracted only 104 of the articles that I wrote and placed them in this book. And that is why it is called 104 Times. In other words, 104 times I wrote letters to the press. At the same time, 104 Times is a compendium of articles, originally letters, that should be seen as a companion to the larger book, My Story, My Song. In writing, there are many things that you cannot really elaborate on, lest the book become too voluminous. And so there are certain concepts and certain political issues that I have touched upon in my autobiography, which are elaborated on in the 104 times. Remember, in writing an autobiography, a person like me must talk about the local politics and international relations. But we cannot be too expansive on these issues in an autobiography. That does not mean to say that you cannot touch on those issues. And so one must find another outlet to elaborate further on those political, ideological, and to some extent economic issues. And that is where the 104 times came in as an outlet, so to speak, and as a companion to the major work, My Story, My Song. So let's talk about My Story, My Song. The book that you see here, it is divided into approximately 14 sections. It took me quite a lot of effort to produce a book of this level. The book comprises of an introduction. It comprises of who I dedicated the book to, and it also makes reference to the persons and institutions to whom I acknowledge, what is called acknowledgement. Because obviously, you know, in publishing books of this nature, you take photographs, you take quotations from sources, and you must give credit to those sources and those photographs. The book speaks quite extensively on what I describe as my roots. My roots meaning, because I'm basically a mixed race person, a mixed race Guyanese, I have my Indian origins and my African origins as well, like so many Guyanese in our country today. My grandparents and my great-great-grandparents on my father's side came as indentured laborers to Guyana. But my grandfather, who is my father's father, who originated from my great-great-grandparents, who were the ones that came as indentured laborers to Guyana, he married to a woman who came here from Barbados and was working at the same institution, that is to say, that it was called the Public Hospital Georgetown at the time. And so my great-grandfather, or my grandfather's, he was married to an African woman who had her origins in Barbados, and thus produced 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys. One of the boys was my father. My father went to England to fight during the Second World War. And while there, he found his wife-to-be, married her and brought her back to Guyana. They also made 6 children, but this time it was 3 boys and 3 girls. I am the last of the 3 boys, and the girls came after. Those are my siblings. And so the book speaks quite extensively about the origin of what is called the Rohi clan, so to speak. The origin of the Rohis from where I come from in Guyana, or British Guyana. So it speaks about my mother's side, and it speaks about my father's side. The book goes on to talk about my boyhood days, or my childhood days, my school days as well. With 3 boys and 3 girls, the girls were mainly at home, but the boys were free as they grew older to, so to speak, roam the streets of the neighborhood, to explore the neighborhood in which they live. And we lived most of the time in the city of Georgetown. I'm a city boy, basically. And I grew up in the city of Georgetown, which I got to know, like as the Guyanese would say, the back of my hand. So, in the city of Georgetown, which has changed tremendously since the 1950s, we have been able to see the transformations that have taken place infrastructurally and otherwise. We went to school in the city. Most of the buildings in those days belonged to the churches, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and so forth. And so I went to school, a public school, that was the property of the Catholic Church in Guyana. I never had the opportunity of attaining a secondary education or university education. But what I can say is that education in those days helped lay a very strong foundation for what many who went to school in those days have become today. The book also talks about the death of my mother, which was a serious blow to the family. Mother died, leaving 6 children for her husband to take care of. But because my dad was working in the interior of the country at a place called Torani in the Berbice region, a new scheme that was being developed under the PPPC government, it was virtually impossible, or almost impossible, for him to take care of 6 children. And so what happened was the family split up. The boys were sent to stay with different relatives, and the girls were sent to stay with other relatives as well. And so we grew up separate from each other. But that was a very interesting experience for me, because the book explains that the aunt with whom I grew up with taught me so many things in life that I'm benefiting from today. I later began to assert myself as a young man growing up, as a teenager. I wanted to be an independent person. I already had a job, but then I lost that job. And then the task was left to me now to find another job. And that was almost impossible in those days because of the lack of qualifications, which was very much needed at that time, as it is going to be needed in the future of Guyana. And so I spent quite a considerable amount of time looking for a job. I even applied to the Guyana Police Force for a job. I sat the entrance examination but never got a reply. And so I assumed that either they lost my application or the results, or I failed the test. I can only speculate. But the fact of the matter is, I never got a response. Eventually, I got a job at a man who owned a small furniture store. He had some sons who were abroad. One of them came back and took charge of the store and developed it into a mega store in the city right now. Many of you may not be aware of it. Some of you may be aware of it. It's called the National Hardware Store. That store has now been handed down to the younger Boyer. Ernest Boyer and Sons were the proprietors of the store. And working with that store brought me into contact with the great national leader of Guyana, Dr. Chedi Jagan. Because it was while he was constructing his house at what is called Plantation Bel Air, he came to that store to purchase some materials for the house, and I was introduced to him by the owner of the store, and we began a small conversation, began to chat, so to speak. He invited me to come to party headquarters, which was known as Freedom House. And I took the opportunity because he told me that there's a library, they have film shows, they have lectures, they have discussions, and there are many things that I can learn from if I visit the party headquarters. And so in the context of asserting myself, as a young man growing up, independence had just come for Guyana in 1966. I was 16 years of age. And at the age of 17, going on to 18, I became a member of the youth organization of the People's Progressive Party. In those days, membership was granted to both, that is to say, to the youth organization and the party as well. So I officially became a member of the People's Progressive Party in 1968 at the age of 18. And thus began the political journey of my life. I've never had any regrets since then. I have never turned back. I've never looked back. And like Frank Sinatra said in his song My Way, regrets I've had a few, but then again, very few to remember. The period that when I joined the People's Progressive Party was a very difficult period in Guyana. That was in 1962 to 64 period. And the book speaks also very dramatically about my experiences in the 62 to 64 period. The riots in the city of Georgetown, the bombings of government buildings, the beating of East Indians, the massacre at Wisma. All those events were taking place at the time when I joined the People's Progressive Party, or had just finished, because those events occurred during 62 to 64. I joined 4 years after, when the country was also still suffering from the trauma of the 60s. And so political life for me started at a very young age. I became very deeply politically involved. There was an organization or institution called ITABO, where young radicals would meet to discuss and talk politics, agree to disagree with each other. I sat in at many of those meetings. I was also invited by the People's Progressive Party to go to participate in another organization that had emerged in the city in what is called the Tiger Bay area, called the Movement Against Oppression. I participated in that meetings of that organization, where there were a lot of intellectuals, a lot of radical intellectuals, young revolutionary people with revolutionary ideas who wanted not only to change Guyana but to change the world. Obviously, there was a lot of idealism in the aims and aspirations of many of the thoughts that they expressed in those days. And as I said in the book, sometimes I left those meetings not only confused, but not able to understand how some of the ideas that they had expressed could be translated and become a reality in Guyana, in order to become a reality in Guyana. But membership in the People's Progressive Party, membership in the Progressive Youth Organization helped to clarify very, very much many of these issues. And that was the guiding role that the PPP played in those days. Because you had leaders, especially Dr. Jagan, who could have explained things so pellucidly, so clearly, so simply, for anyone can understand. And that is why, for example, workers and farmers were attracted to his leadership and the People's Progressive Party. Eventually, I was given a job at the Mirror newspaper. In those days, there was a machine called a linotype machine, which helped to print the newspaper. Now everything is done basically by computers. But in those days, that is what they call the old style way of printing a newspaper. Those days are gone. But working at the Mirror brought to me some new experiences in my life. Again, in the book, I speak about my experiences working there at that newspaper, and it was Mr. Jagan, who was the editor of the newspaper at the time, who invited me to think about being a journalist. Now, this was something, of course, that was very challenging. What is a journalist? I mean, I knew that journalists wrote articles, sent them into the newspaper, they were edited and they were printed and so forth. But to take on the role of a journalist, to me, was something beyond my comprehension. And so Mrs. Jagan introduced me, or asked me, to go to do what is called reviews of films, what is called film reviews. To go to some movies and write what I thought about the movies. Now that was a very clever way of introducing me to journalism, a very practical way, so to speak. You go see a picture, as we would say in Guyana, you like it, you like the stars, you like the story, and you write your impressions of what you saw. You write your impressions of the movie. And that is how I started out. It came across very simply. It came across very naturally. The flow was quite understandable. And that's how I started out as a journalist. Then I was sent also to write reports, to participate, reports coming out of press conferences. Now there's a little story I want to say at this point in time. On one occasion, Mr. Jagan sent me to do a press conference that was being hosted by the CARICOM Secretary General at that time, whose name was Mr. Roderick Rainford. At that time, the CARICOM headquarters was in the Bank of Guyana building. And so I went there. I took with me a copy of a National Geographic magazine which Mrs. Jagan used to subscribe to. National Geographic magazine is a very colorful magazine. It has a lot of pictures and deals with, flora and fauna and things like that. And so while I was waiting for the press conference to start, I was going through this magazine, and a gentleman came in and sat next to me. And so he asked me where I'm from, which newspaper am I representing? And I told him I'm representing the Mirror newspaper. To my surprise, the man's response was, "Oh, that communist paper." Well, I didn't worry to answer him because this was a senior gentleman. And so I did not answer him. I continued looking through the magazine. And then he turned to me again and he asked me, "What is that you're reading?" So I turned to the cover of the magazine and let him saw, and there he saw it was a National Geographic. And once again, to my surprise, he then blurted out, "Oh, I didn't know that communists read those things." So I said to myself, what kind of behavior is this? Now that taught me a lifelong lesson. That is to say, the perceptions of people, of other people. How people judge other people wrongfully. There was nothing wrong in me having a particular ideological or philosophical conviction, and at the same time reading widely. Again, this was another interesting way Mrs. Jagan encouraged you to read widely, and not only to read the Marxist classics, to go to see movies of different types, to read widely. She was the one that introduced me to many classical writers, Russia, French, English, and even West Indian. And so I mentioned this in my book because I consider this to be part of my political upbringing, part of my political education, to read as widely as you can. And we will come to this question of reading as I go on to talk about the book launch. It was during those days, after working at the Mirror, while working at the Mirror, I was sent abroad for the first time. My first trip out of this country was in 1972. And it was to Cuba. In those days, it was very difficult to get to Cuba. Extremely difficult. So I was given two options, believe it or not. I was given two options to travel to Cuba. I had to either travel from Guyana to London and then to Moscow, and then from Moscow to Havana. Or travel throughout the entire Latin America up to Mexico and then come down back to Cuba. The choice was mine. I chose to travel through Latin America, up to Mexico and then to Cuba. And that again was a wonderful experience that helped me understand politics in Latin America the life of people in Latin, or the lives of people in Latin America. Even though I just passed through those countries and spent maybe 1 day, 2 days, and some days, sometimes 3 days, like in Chile, I spent almost a whole week waiting on a seat to get on a plane to fly directly. And when that became impossible, I then flew from Chile to Mexico, and then from Mexico to Havana. Cuba, of course, being the first country that I went to influence my political upbringing. And I still hold in high esteem the many sacrifices made by the Cuban people, as they are still today, having regard to the fact that they are still faced by this crushing embargo that is virtually punishing the Cuban people for something that they never did. So after Cuba, I was sent to Moscow to pursue further studies. Moscow was also very enlightening for me. I returned to Guyana, and as the book points out, I began to become more deeply involved at a higher level in the political struggle. Now that is the period when we had a lot of changes were taking place. We had revolution in Nicaragua, you had revolution in Grenada, you had revolution in Suriname, and you had revolutions in many other parts of the world that were taking place around that time. Changes in governments by force of arms and by mass uprisings of people. The government of that time was the PNC by a man by the name of President Borno. He took some progressive policies at home and abroad, foreign policy and domestic policy in terms of nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy, etc. That was the time when also Dr. Walter Rodney came back to Guyana, which I describe as the Rodney Era. There were mass public meetings. I participated in most of those meetings that were held at that time that was called the Border Mall. And people were prepared to take to the streets. And I think Barnum was fearful that here was a black man that was challenging another black man, who then was the president, to remove him from office. The Rodney era was an era of political and social turmoil. The preparation and the readiness of the people to become organized and mobilized to bring about a change in the political life of the country. The PPP and the WPA worked very closely during those days. That cooperation eventually led to what is called the Committee for Defense of Democracy to boycott a referendum that was to be held in the country. That referendum was successfully boycotted. That further exposed the Barnum government, even though he got a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly, so he could make any changes to the Constitution, and that is what he did. And that is what is called the Barnum Constitution that we're living with up to now. Rodney, of course, was assassinated, and we know that eventually, or I should say only recently, a commission of inquiry was established. It was discontinued by the Granger administration, but with the return of the PPP to office, the commission of inquiry's results were published and changes were made to the reason why and who were the intellectual authors behind Rodney's assassination. So there was a tremendous amount of cooperation among the political and social forces in the country. And this book speaks to a large extent about those developments. Political alliances, the importance of political alliances, what kind of results those alliances bring in our country. After the Committee for Defense of Democracy came the Patriotic Coalition for Democracy, another alliance of a broader spectrum of political forces. And it was the PCD that laid the basis for the changes in 1992 in our country, October 1992, when elections were held and electoral reforms with the Carter Center playing a major role in the country, helping to bring about electoral reforms in the country and also to bring about the change of government with the PPPC in office. So that was an interesting period, but I should have mentioned that before all these changes took place, I was sent to a place that was a country that was then called Czechoslovakia, Prague, the capital of that city. I spent 4 years there in that country working as a journalist. And it's when I came back. In fact, while I was abroad, I heard about the death of Walter Rodney. I was not in the country when that occurred. So the victory of 1992 saw what is called the dawn of a new era. Chedi Jagan, who was the premier in the 57 to 64 period, was now the president of the country after 20-something years in the political wilderness. He now became the president. He began to fight as energetically as he can for certain economic reforms, social reforms, debt relief. That was his major platform. Cutting of the budget that was being spent on a number of ministries. For example, the Office of the President, the Foreign Ministry, he reduced the budget because there a lot of foreign exchange was being spent, and his task was to conserve and hold a tight budget as possible. And so he pursued what is called developmental economics. He pursued a very progressive foreign policy. But unfortunately, he was not able to complete his term in office or his tenure in office. And the book speaks about his passing and what came after his passing. Sam Hines, who was then the prime minister, was sworn in as the president. There was a brief transition. The party established what's called the A-team. A-team meaning Janet Jagan as the president for the next elections in 97. Janet Jagan as the presidential candidate, Sam Hines as the prime ministerial candidate, and Bar Jagdeo as the number 3, so to speak, so that in case anything happens, Jagdeo would be sworn in. Jagdeo was eventually sworn in as the prime minister, and then eventually he became the president. But in the meantime, you had Sam as the president to serve out the tenure up to the 97 elections. Janet Jagan went up as the presidential candidate for the 97 elections. She became the president, she was elected, and incidentally, she got more votes than her husband. So, Janet Jagan as the president, she had an extremely rough time. Protests, demonstrations, you had what is called the Hardmanston Accord. And eventually, owing to ill health, she retired from the government as president, and Jagdeo took over. So you had Jagdeo as the president, and Sam Hines reverted back to the prime minister. The Jagdeo era was, of course, a very interesting period as well. Janet Jagan was not able to do too much, but she did a lot of traveling. She did a lot of traveling in Latin America in particular. Sam was a kind of a holding president. But when Jagdeo became the president, the country saw a tremendous amount of transformations in almost every sector. So, eventually, the PPP continued in office from 1992 to 2015. And during that period, in fact, that is a period that a lot of people in this country always wanted to go back to when the PPP lost elections in 2015 and when the APNU AFC came into office. So many sacrifices were made during this period. A lot of comrades belonging to the party were jailed. A lot of them were beaten up by the security forces. Many were imprisoned, and so forth. And so the book makes the point, and in fact mentions the names of many of the comrades who helped and participated in the struggle to bring the PPP to office in 92, and to keep them in office by voting over and over at free and fair election, even though there were questions about the election by the opposition PNC. But the fact of the matter is those elections were free and fair because they were endorsed by the international community and foreign observers. And so the 1992 to 2015 period was the most invigorating period for Guyana. Unfortunately, we lost the elections in 2015. The APNU-AFC came into office. That is also described some of the reasons why we lost the elections and what happened during that period, what was taking place. And in fact, this is where 104 Times comes in, because 104 Times, in that book, I wrote a lot of articles during that period when the APNU-AFC was in office, describing political events that were taking place at the time. And so while my story, my song, did touch on what happened in the 2015 to 2020 period, the bulk of the events that occurred during those 5 years are described or are written about in 104 Times. So that's a political companion document, as I said, to my story, my song. So the PPP in government pursued very progressive foreign policies, very progressive domestic policies, and throughout the entire period, tremendous emphasis was put on the question of the social sector, health, education, social services, the elderly, children. These were the major focus of the PPP during its period in office from 1990 to 2015. Border issues, our problems with Venezuela, problems with Suriname. Fortunately, we never had border issues with Brazil. But the border issues was also a constant irritant in all this period. Each president had their own, what I described in the article in 104 Times, had their taste of the bitter cup of the Venezuelan issue. So, loss of government came about as a result of the no confidence motion in the National Assembly. And I write expansively about that experience in Guyana, in the National Assembly. The no confidence motion was opposed by the opposition or by the government, who was there at the time, the APNU-AFC. And as a result, that led to a number of court battles in the local courts, what is called the lower courts, up to the appeal court, and then to the Caribbean Court of Justice. A lot of back and forth. The courts became the major arena of struggle in order to settle what happened during the no confidence motion. And then also the question of elections was thrown into the discussion, because then elections were held in the midst of all of this, and yet the government refused to accept the results of the elections. Everyone knew that the PPPC had won the election with Irfan Ali as the presidential candidate. The whole country knew that. But the APNU-AFC tried every trick in the book, resorted to all kinds of shenanigans to try to undo the results of the elections. In other words, to try to trap democracy in a cage held by them. Unfortunately for them, they did not succeed. Unfortunately for the Guyanese people overcame with the tremendous help of the international community. The United States, Canada, United Kingdom, the European Union, the OAS, the Commonwealth, CARICOM. Tremendous pressure was put on the Granger administration to remove themselves from office and to allow the Irfan Ali administration to take office. Eventually, after tremendous pressure and the recounting of the votes, the intervention of CARICOM with observers, and so forth, the Irfan Ali administration assumed office. And thus began another new era for Guyanese people and our future of this country. Now, there are still challenges. The major challenge is the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, that is affecting almost every country in the world, and Guyana is no exception. So that is a major challenge, not only for Guyana and many other countries, in terms of looking ahead. The good thing is that oil and gas have been discovered, and Guyana is now on the highway of becoming a new economy, developing a new economy, a brighter future for its people. Of course, there's a lot of debate taking place in the country, a lot of questions being asked about whether the benefits will come to the Guyanese people. Government is answering those questions. And in a democracy, it is quite understandable for those questions and these issues to be discussed openly. The media is also playing an important role in the course of that discourse, in the course of that those discussions, and that what is called narrative. So we have to place our trust and our confidence in the government that the majority of people voted for. We have to place our trust and confidence in the government that has managed to overcome the difficulties, the challenges in the court, the attempts by the Granger administration to outsmart and outwit the electorate. And those are some of the challenges we're now facing. My friends, this book is highly recommended. So is the companion to My Story, My Song. Looking ahead, the future for Guyana is obviously bright. But like in any democracy, there will be challenges. This book ends with a quotation that I will read, which says the following. They say never judge a book by its cover. The book the reader now holds in their hands is a good example of a book that should not be judged by the title. My Story, My Song comes from a hymn called Blessed Assurance. As I said at the book launch, that was a hymn that inspired me a lot, and so I continue. This book's title can be deemed misleading, but a book can represent a person who ought not to be prejudged for his or her work. I wish I could have done more in joining with others to bridge the deep ethnic and political divide that so menacingly threatens to burst asunder the social fabric of our fragile democracy. But the age-old problem seems to be deeply embedded in the Guyanese national psyche. That is why it will take years of hard work before it shows signs of it beginning to gradually wither away. Perhaps it will be the next generation to whom the responsibility will fall to heal the wounds and lift Guyana onwards, upwards. And therein lies my optimism about the future of Guyana. The book talks about our trials and our travels. It talks about the difficult path that I personally have traveled as a politician. I tried my best to reflect those experiences in this book. Like any publication, it is open for criticism. It is open for observation. It is open for review. But I can only say that all that is written in this book are my honest interpretations, my honest expressions, and my convicted beliefs. I therefore wish to recommend this book to you. It's available on Amazon. It's also available at the Kindle store. It's available at Walmart. It's available at Target. and it's also available at the Barnes and Noble bookstores around the world. In a few weeks' time, at the largest book fair in Asia, that's the Beijing Book Fair, it will also be available at that fair. Thank you very much, and once again, the book is highly recommended for reading. Thank you.